welcome back to the Warbird Mistress. You'll notice that the film here is a little bit different. I'm here at my dining room table with the desktop, or tabletop, I guess you could say. And I was requested to do a video on the Thach Weave. It's a little bit difficult to do because I want to make a whole video of it and show what the Japanese tactics were without getting too deep into it and making it boring. And then I remembered that there was the John Thach series of training films done by Walt Disney, of all people. So, well, through the United States Navy, but the Department of the Navy does a lot of things that are considered worthy of Disney. So, I'm going to set this up as a reaction video. The original film is, of course, public domain. Periscope Film, as usual, claims copyright over it, but obviously this commentary is on the original material. They haven't changed it as far as I know or done anything, so let's see how monetization goes. And then we go on with the show. So, press play. And I'm just going to pause it when something comes up. Bureau of Aeronautics, the fundamental fixed gunnery approaches. Now, of course, they mean fixed guns, not guns on the ground.
The fundamental tactics by which enemy air power is knocked out.
Of course, we have gun camera footage here.
Years of practice and tested finally in the heat of combat. This is no hit and miss procedure and may be compared, in a sense, with the perfectly timed activities of the
Wildcat.
A firing approach, like the performance of a well-coordinated athlete, looks easy. And it is easy when performed by a pilot who has been properly trained.
Of course, that's John Thach himself there, uncredited.
Hours of intelligent practice. Likewise, the golfer, the acrobat, the diver. There is a direct parallel between the form of a champion golfer and the maneuvers of an expert fighter pilot.
This guy obviously never cheated on a scorecard.
Continuously, intelligently, with every club in his bag. If he is weak in any one type of play, his chances of winning a tournament are greatly impaired. So it is with the fixed gunner.
It's also not advisable to fly drunk versus golf. Kind of a tradition.
The golfer has his bag of clubs from which to choose. We have our gunnery approaches, our types of attack. This rough composite model shows an enemy bomber surrounded by the various gunnery approaches. From this it is evident that when you know how to make the fundamental gunnery approaches, you are able to attack him successfully from any angle. Your choice of approach in combat will depend on the type.
Let's pause it for a second here.
Fire opposition of the enemy aircraft.
So it looks like we've got was it the Type 97 up there? I believe was one that actually didn't see service. It was already obsolete. Mitsubishi Type 97 down there. Transport. Got the Nakajima Navy G92. It's a little fuzzy. Not exactly sure. I guess a version of the Kate, I guess, is what they're going for. And then, of course, in the bottom, the Centaur Zero, which, ironically, none of these actually have the intelligence names attached, but it's an interesting little section there. I would have expected to see a Kate, a Val, a Jake, or a Pete. Of course, the Zeke naturally, but let's continue.
No matter what approach you use, there is a definite pattern to follow, which will bring results. These approaches have been proved in actual combat and will continue to be effective if they are carried out with skill and good judgment. There are 4 fundamental approaches. The side approach, left or right with altitude variations. The overhead approach from the same or opposite directions to the target. The head-on from above or below, and the stern approach with its variable starting positions.
So basically, from the sides, from above, from the front, or from the back. Uh, Looks kind of like a composite of a Sally there, and in the American side, it's basically a generic version of a Wildcat. And in this video, I already watched it, of course. You're going to see that there are a mix of Wildcats, Hellcats, and Corsairs, but without really as much discussion of one over the other. But just to remember that as we're going through this.
The secret of success in all gunnery approaches is proper timing. Carefully time all your approaches to arrive at the desired firing angle and the effective range of 1,000 feet simultaneously. Continue through the firing ranges, break away underneath the target, and start your recovery for a second attack. Against multi-placed aircraft, you will have more opportunity to use the side approach than any other. The side approach may be made from 3 different levels: high side, flat side, low side.
It's also worth noting here that the Japanese were not really big on beam defense, so in fact the Japanese had very lightly armed bombers and recon aircraft. So the beam approach does make a lot of sense. Of course, you'll notice that this is the Navy film, so you're going to be almost, I think there's not even a single instance of Axis aircraft from the ETO being shown, even though the Navy did, of course, see combat in the European theater, especially in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So let's go on.
As seen from above, the flight paths of the high, flat, and low side are identical. The same S-turn is used whether you shoot from a high, flat, or low angle. This is an obvious tactical advantage because the enemy free gunner doesn't know which approach you intend to use. And in every case, the run is started from a position higher than that of the target. It is of utmost importance that you carefully gauge the radius of each turn, smoothly tightening or easing off in order to stay in the groove. By properly timing the run, our pilots have consistently made this attack without receiving a single bullet hole from enemy free gunfire.
Don't know how true that is, but
in executing the side approach, the pilot may maneuver so that he arrives at the firing position about 40 degrees above the level of the target, high side, within 10 degrees of the level of the target, flat side, or about 20 degrees below the level of the target, low side.
I would say also that just looking at this came to mind, at the 10-degree angle, the flat side, you have a much smaller target to hit. You're basically trying to hit the fuselage because you don't really see much of the wing. If you're above and below, you have a much bigger target, and depending on where the fuel tanks are located, I could imagine that that would be important.
The ideal position to commence a side approach is predicated to a certain extent on the speed of the target and the desired firing angle. When firing on a quarter approach between 45 and 30 degrees, more shooting time is available than when firing on a beam approach between 80 and 65 degrees.
Of course, this is deflection shooting.
More hits will be made between 45 and 30 degrees. Your plane becomes an easier target for the enemy free gunner. At first, at firing angles between 55 and 35 degrees, and then gradually work up to firing angles more nearly on the beam. In making a high side approach, it is best to gain a position about 3,000 feet ahead on a 45-degree bearing to the target's line of flight, with an altitude advantage of about 1,200 feet.
So as in most American tactic videos, it always does kind of presume that you're above the Japanese.
That you learn to feel in the air.
Hot Wheels.
First turn carefully. That's where you make your money.
I kind of want to build this now.
Once you start an approach, keep your eye on the target. Reverse the turn, keep the lead up, while sliding down the curved track to fire.
Now, of course, one of the things here is that it's in motion. The target's in motion, the fighter's in motion, the world is in motion. We're all in motion. The problem with that is that the American fighters are going to be faster than most of the Japanese aircraft in general. The Wildcat is going to be faster than a Sally, definitely faster than a Kate or an Ann or a Val. I mean, you're looking at, with it, almost 100-mile-an-hour difference, sometimes at least a 50-mile-an-hour difference, depending, of course, on the model of aircrafts involved. But, I mean, even the Betty, faster than the Nell or the Sally, but you're still going to have that advantage in play. Plus, you're dealing with a heavier aircraft. So diving is always going to make the American plane accelerate. I would imagine that one of the things that he didn't mention here, but would come naturally to the pilot, hopefully, is coming down on the throttle a little bit so that you're not accelerating into the turn and then overshooting your target.
Before any attack can be carried out successfully, there are certain important steps to take.
All right, now that's obviously a great picture of a Grumman Wildcat there.
Go over that checkoff list. Generator charging. Mixture automatic rich. Guns charged. Master and selector gun switches on.
Now, you don't see this very often. I think a lot of people presume that once you're in the cockpit, the guns are active. And also, I think that because it's never really shown how the guns were cocked, seeing those levers there makes it a lot more, I guess you could say, comprehensible about how it was that you would have to unjam your guns in flight. Of course, with the Modus or with really any machine gun, all you can really do is just keep trying to get the next round into the chamber and clear the jam. Right there, you're going to see something you don't really see that often, and I think it's important to look at it and say, if your gun's jam in combat, that's going to be where you're going to be pulling and pushing. And as for your gun switches, it's obviously a safety measure. Your guns are not always on, especially in electrically fired ones. You don't want to drain your alternator, or however it was that they were done. But just one of those things I noticed that you don't usually see in other videos.
Tab set for firing speed. Sight on.
Yes. Big thing overlooked is that the reflector sights in World War II were a huge, huge advantage for pilots compared to the years past. It showed you where your rounds were going, not just where your nose was pointed. And it's one of these major technological advantages for the World War II pilot that I think a lot of people just either are unaware of, or they maybe because of video games, they still think of that pipper being fixed, an iron sight, so to say. Whereas in reality, it wasn't. It was, a very highly sensitive, very, I guess you could say for the time advanced, matter of having a proper reflective sight.
Think of the aileron first when a change of direction is necessary. Keep the ball in the center. It must be there when you squeeze the trigger if you expect to hit. Take a good look around and sight all other planes in the firing group. Then keep your eye on the target and watch him like a hawk.
Some good Disney animation there.
Start the run, make a smooth, nose-high turn toward the target. Drop the nose as necessary to keep the enemy constantly in sight. As you come to a point almost abeam of the target, start to bank in the opposite direction to reverse your turn. Increase the throttle, bring the line of sight up, and keep it up ahead of the target. When the effective range is reached, squeeze the trigger and fire as long as you can hold that lead.
To be honest, actually just reminds me a lot of bird hunting. Don't aim where the bird is, aim where the bird's going to be. And I think generationally, I mean, obviously, I grew up in a very active family that hunting, fishing, shooting were just a part of my childhood. If back then, you had a more rural population and the suburbs hadn't developed yet, then I could see that translates into people being better shots in general. I think Dick Bong commented on that being a big factor with having the P-38's guns all centered in that, right in front of the pilot, that it helped shoot. For someone that was used to, just shotguns and rifles. And nowadays, I could see that being just a difference in training, even with all the automated stuff that makes sure that a cannon goes where it's supposed to be. You still kind of have to have a feeling of where your rounds are going, and it becomes instinctive. If you're out your first time and you've only shot targets, and all of a sudden you're going after, a chucker, you're going to miss because you don't understand the speed and angle of attack and everything else that's going on in the flight pattern of that partridge. Personally, I've seen birds do some bizarre things, and yeah, I've missed plenty of shots too. But like I said, it's just reminds me a lot of, kind of gauging what a chucker's doing before you pull the trigger. So anyway.
Then cease firing. Break away downward, and then parallel the course of the target.
Of course, breakaway downward is very important because the Zero cannot dive as fast as American aircraft. It's a lighter aircraft. Of course, you're not going to get that same amount of forward propulsion and the advantage that gravity gives in a dive. So it's kind of important that it's not leveling off at that point, because you can imagine the escorts would just swarm right on you.
Pass under the target, begin a steady 20-degree climb either to the right or left. Use your excess speed in regaining position and altitude for another run. In all side approaches, it becomes increasingly difficult to hold the proper lead as the range decreases. This is because of more G's due to the quick change of direction.
All right, that's cute.
No longer hold your lead. Concentrate on breaking away to gain position for another run. The mechanical principle of the side approach is simple. It is merely a matter of timing the S-turn to arrive at the point in the flight path where the target, in effect, hooks that path and pulls you through. You continue firing down this theoretical road and break away before being pulled behind the target. If you have
For some reason, it makes me think of graphs in maths class, but okay.
And find that you never can regain enough lead.
And of course, it also puts you within the tail gunner's range.
Exactly the same as the high side, except that it may be started from a slightly lower level. A favorable altitude advantage in this case would be between 600 and 900 feet. Go over the checkoff list and start the first run. Now drop the nose to the approximate level of the target and stay in the groove. As you come out of the second turn, increase throttle and continue on into the firing point. As before, you pass on.
Apparently that bullet curves.
Parallel the target. You don't gain as much speed in this run as on the high side. Consequently, it takes longer to get up to the second attack position.
Also means that you have a little bit more firing time.
The low side approach also starts from a point above the level of the target.
I'm not sure what aircraft that's supposed to be there, but
in this case, you
looks almost like a Bearcat for some reason.
Feet above and 3,000 feet ahead of the target. When you have reached the starting position and have completed the firing checkoff list, make the first turn toward the target. Let the nose drop below the level of the target, but not behind it, and keep the nose down until the reverse turn is begun. At this point, you should be below the target and ahead of his beam. Give it full throttle and bring the line of sight well ahead of the target's path.
True about the throttle, because you're going to be losing speed in a tighter turn.
In the position of firing, the pilot finds himself almost on his back. Break away sharply by pulling back on the stick and then rolling out to parallel.
There's a great view right there. Actually, I think you see how, yeah, he's approaching basically on the level and then turning almost upside down before coming back around. I could imagine, you know, this happening at a couple hundred miles an hour, but they're both moving at a couple hundred miles an hour, so I mean the difference is still going to be 50, 100 miles, and it's just something that I think takes a lot of skill, and if you're not attacking a lone aircraft, this could be very, very dangerous. If you say had 9, you know, typically Japanese, you know, fought in V formations, or VIX really, the evenly spaced groups of 3, so you would have 9 in a formation generally. If you're just getting shot at from every angle, I could see that the flat approach that you don't really get that much speed would be very dangerous, even just in terms of collision. I could definitely see this resulting in an amateur pilot just crashing right into, especially a 2-motored aircraft.
It's longer to regain position for a second attack after making this run because of the loss of speed and the uphill climb during the approach. Let's analyze the mistakes in this low side approach. The pilot fails to gauge his turns correctly, and he falls behind.
Not particularly sure where the target aircraft is, but
slow uphill approach, and he never gets within close firing range. He could help the situation somewhat by the use of full throttle in his final climb. A loss of speed in the final climb creates a tendency to drift too far astern and be pulled flat. Allowing yourself to be pulled flat is a common error in any side approach. It can also be caused by failure to reverse the turn soon enough.
He's not really compensating for the speed of the enemy aircraft there either.
It is necessary to execute a correct turn. You are also in error if you start too far out to the side.
There's a lot of spatial relations going on here.
You will not be able to reach effective range if you start the run too far back. This pilot drops his nose a little too much in the first turn, but he gauges his turns correctly, and by using plenty of throttle, is able to reach closer firing range.
It gives you a good idea of how difficult it might be to spot another aircraft at distance too, you know, the way that these shots are set up.
If the turns are made too tight, it results in long-range fire or a tail chase to catch up.
Yeah, tail chase also means you're getting shot at.
Don't get caught treading air or using excess airspace when gaining a position for a second attack. Decide where you want to go and get there quickly. Any lost motion will cause you to lose valuable advantage. If you have an enemy to attack and can get to a position for an overhead run, by all means do it. You can make this attack if you're on the same course as the target or on the opposite course. But in either case, a greater altitude advantage is needed than for any other approach. This altitude advantage will vary according to the speed of the target and the type of plane you're flying. The faster your plane, the more altitude you will require.
And there, actually you see it right there, you've got, just go back a second. At the top you see you've got the Corsair, and then you've got the Hellcat and the Wildcat. All in a row there.
In this approach, the enemy is usually surprised. This approach requires considerable practice to perfect, but it can be mastered by any pilot who analyzes the maneuver intelligently. Also, the speed gain can be used for recovering to almost any desired position for a second attack.
Notably that this is
To
something that a radial engine is a big advantage.
They are forced to aim straight up. In the modern service,
You're not having fuel skip out on you, which anybody that studies the Battle of Britain can tell you that about inline engines. Not inline, I'm sorry, about
3,000 feet or more,
V
and just enough to one side of the target so that you can look back and down at him comfortably. After gaining this position, follow the groove from the moment you swing into the run.
You're not just diving right at them.
As in all other approaches, carefully control the radius of this turn. So that you will be directly above the target flight path as you enter the dive. After completing the checkoff list, start a smooth, nose-high turn toward the target path with the idea of completing a 180-degree turn and rolling over to inverted flight at a point ahead of and in the same vertical plane that contains the target. Then drop the nose on down and sweep up slightly ahead of the target. You should reach effective range while still
Looks like a Kate down there.
60 degrees, which will be flattened out rapidly as you follow the target. However, you should pass him at an angle of not less than 45 degrees if your timing is right.
Also, doesn't take much to light up a Japanese plane.
By doing a half roll at the right instant and dropping the nose on the target so that the firing angle and range are arrived at as before. This type of approach is more difficult to time correctly because at a point before the half roll, you're likely to be blind on the target. However, it is possible to drop your wing in order to keep the target in view and at the proper moment continue on over and down on him.
Yeah, it's basically what you see when you start to see people roll into an attack is, there is this right here. It's a little bit easier to see the three-dimensionality of it here versus in a lot of movies where you just see the roll and that's it.
The most common error in the overhead attack is swinging too wide and passing on through the vertical plane of the target. Once you're in the vertical plane, it is so easy to hit.
You're going for that nose-on attack that, of course, Germans definitely knew about attacking Allied bombers with.
With the nose pointed high above the horizon, we move to the vertical plane and roll over.
And there it is.
Another error is in starting so low that you haven't enough airspace to complete the maneuver, and you dive without ever getting your sight ahead of the target.
Looks like a great way to crash into the other aircraft.
Obviously, you shouldn't employ this type of attack when the target is too low to enable you to pull out of your dive safely. This gentleman is a boner a pilot never pulls more than once. The head-on approach is seldom selected by the fixed gunner because the range changes so rapidly. The firing time is short, and after the breakaway, the target is gone.
If I had a whole room to do demonstrations, it'd be nice.
To regain quickly a position for a second attack. Despite the disadvantages of the head-on approach, the situation may arise when enemy bombers or torpedo planes are so close to the dropping angle when you meet them that there is no time for any other type of approach. On two-place dive bombers or torpedo planes, you're equally safe in making the run from above.
Kate's actually a three-place aircraft, but okay.
The pullout is above the target if the run is started from above. Experienced pilots prefer to make this run from slightly below, recovering below, because they're better able to close to a short range without danger of collision. It is obvious in this type of run you can open fire at a longer range due to the rapid rate of approach and the added relative speed.
Notice that's got 6 guns there.
Think of the enemy plane as the familiar target sleeve. The run should be started out far enough to get lined up with the enemy's flight path. If you find yourself off to one side, use plenty of aileron to get lined up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, versus rudder, which would be the, yaw versus roll.
Watch how he brings himself into line by quickly banking and turning soon enough in order to meet the target sleeve head on. If you haven't time to get into
and not shoot the guy towing it.
By banking and approaching a few degrees off the target's flight path, you can still make an effective approach. The approach from the stern is the simplest of all fixed gunnery runs. Normally, this approach should only be used against...
Oh, there's a 0.
But under certain circumstances, it may be employed against any type of aircraft. The tail approach may start from almost any position abaft the beam of the target. In case the enemy has no tail stinger, you can make your approach from slightly below.
I think the tunnel gun on the Jewel told a lot of people that, same as with the Avenger and enemy pilots.
Due to the relative position, it is usually impossible to quickly regain a favorable spot for a second run. You can readily see that when used against planes with tail turrets and against rear guns, it should be employed with the greatest of caution. Besides a thorough knowledge of the basic approaches, it is important to realize the exceptions. There are times when it will be necessary to barrel on in an attack without gaining a favorable position. For example, when you are flying escort on friendly
Had some Dauntlesses down there.
It is your responsibility to protect them, and you must be prepared to do it under any circumstances. You may have an opportunity to use only a part of one of these runs. For instance, if you meet the enemy on an opposite course and you have enough altitude, simply roll over on your back for an overhead. Or if you're out to one side and far enough ahead, the last part of a side approach can be used. As a matter of fact, there is no conceivable position for the initiation of an attack where the fundamentals of these gunnery approaches cannot be used. If in practice you're not hitting, analyze your approach from start to finish.
Got the target tug there.
Point is in error. Try it at a slightly different altitude, or vary your bearing on the target. Don't be discouraged. It is difficult even for an experienced pilot to measure off distance through open space. Check your turns, your shooting ranges, and angles. If these are apparently okay, your point of aim must be incorrect. Talk over your runs with an instructor or a pilot who is hitting. Possibly they can show you where you're in error. Now, let us imagine you are able to gain a position in combat to make any type of run you choose. First, ask yourself these questions. What is the type and speed of the target?
There you go, BF-110.
What is your own plane's performance as compared to theirs? How many friendly and enemy planes are involved?
Ironically, their Zeros were in a Finger 4.
By attacking from the clouds or out of the sun?
Goes into a lot more of this in the fighter video, which is coming up next.
Remember to go over the checkoff list. Never lose sight of the target. Fly your plane smoothly through the turns and toward the target. Time these turns to arrive at the firing angle and the effective range at the same instant. break away sharply and recover to a position for a second attack.
Sounds like a lot to think about at one time, but, it goes to show how much time was spent in training.
It's not hard to see that when so many factors are involved, and since any one of them could alter the choice of attack, you must exert every effort to become deadly in all approaches. The side approach, the overhead, the head-on, and the stern approach.
Yeah, I did notice that the overhead there actually is not head-on ever. It's always approaching from the aft.
All Navy fighter pilots regard the unescorted, although heavily gunned bomber as cold meat.
I wouldn't exactly say heavily armed, but okay.
You have learned that the side approach...
Nice picture of a Corsair there.
...correctly unless it is started out ahead of the target and to one side. However, if you are about 45 degrees on the bow of the target, the distance away can be varied. As a matter of fact, in combat, it is sometimes desirable to start a considerable distance away, to come in at high speed through enemy fighter protection to get to the bombers.
Of course, the Corsair could do that. So could the Hellcat, but interesting that they didn't choose a Wildcat for that.
This target plane. In this side approach, the pilot will shoot from an angle on the quarter, about 40 to 50 degrees. Note the fairly long shooting time. Here is an approach more nearly on the beam, where the shooting time is relatively short, but obviously the opposing free gunner will have little time to draw a bead on the fighter. Now, on a target sleeve, follow this same approach from the pilot's viewpoint. Notice the extreme angle of attack and how quickly the range decreases. You can see that in this beam attack, you've got to be on when you open fire. The
Distance closes quickly.
For practice, show you the ideal spot to commence an approach. This pilot has enough altitude to make an overhead approach, but is too far out to the side. He recognizes this fact, however, and governs his first turn accordingly.
Interesting that he's banking, but it's almost a slip more than an actual, as you say, an actual rolling turn. And there he goes.
Rolling over to inverted flight, he sweeps his sight up ahead to fire before being pulled flat.
You can imagine too just the stress on the pilots doing this. The body can only handle so much gravitational force.
In this overhead approach, the fighter is nearer to the correct position. He is rolling over immediately without wasting any time. This attack develops rapidly, and the opposing free gunner has little time to get set before it is all over, and the fighter is moving away with a terrific speed advantage. The overhead approach has a particular advantage.
Back to the Wildcat.
Once in position, the fighter can attack no matter what move the enemy may make. The fighter, by using his ailerons, pivots on his nose, matching any evasive turn, and drops.
Not that the Japanese were really big on evasive turns for bombers.
Recovery can be made with equal facility to the right or left. In making the head-on approach, you must get directly ahead and close to the same level of the enemy, bringing your line of sight to match his line of flight. It isn't always easy to accomplish, but when you are lined up correctly, you will have almost a no-deflection shot.
It kind of helps that the Japanese were not really known to
Use the
maneuver
above
much and that they kept very
instructions to
simple
reposition in time to
formations.
settle down
You
before you head
really
for
could
the
just
target.
pick off a bunch of bombers. Of course, in the Marianas, we learned that.
Remember, you've got to get far enough ahead to make this run. By keeping the target in view, smooth turns and proper timing will bring you exactly into the correct position.
Barely see that there. There we go.
In the stern approach, it is important to break away below and turn to avoid enemy front gunfire. The intelligent combat pilot knows his responsibilities, and he strives for perfection in fundamentals in order to achieve a cool, smooth, machine-like precision in action.
Machine-like precision, but also adaptable. A far cry from the Japanese, who basically had one tactic through the whole war, from the 30s up to 1945.
Perfect teamwork of planes in battle is the result of each individual performing his duty with the skill and confidence gained through constant rehearsal. Gunnery approaches are the punches of the combat plane. Knowing how to direct these punches quicker, harder, and smarter than your opponent is the only sure way to knock him out.
Classic Disney animation there at the end.